to like and subscribe for more videos like this.
Here we go again. Let's continue reading from the projectgutenberg.org, How It Works. We've been focusing on steam engines and steam boilers. It's very boring, but should be relaxing and hopefully help you clear your mind or drift to sleep. Let's pick up with the ever-important water gauge. No fitting of a boiler is more important than the water gauge, which shows the level at which the water stands. The engineer must continually consult his gauge, for if the water gets too low, pipes and other surfaces exposed to the furnace flames may burn through with disastrous results, while, on the other hand, too much water will cause bad steaming. A section of an ordinary gauge is seen in Figure 12. It consists of two parts, each furnished with a gland, to make a steam light joint round the glass tube, which is inserted through the hole covered by the plug. The cocks are normally opened, allowing the ingress of steam and water respectively to the tube. Cock is kept closed unless for any reason it is necessary to blow steam or water through the gauge. The holes can be cleaned out if the plugs are removed. Most gauges on high-pressure boilers have a thick glass screen in front, so that in the event of the tube breaking, the steam and water may not blow directly onto the attendants. A further precaution is to include two ball valves near the ends of the glass gauge. Under ordinary conditions, the balls lie in depressions clear of the ways, but when a rush of steam or water occurs, they are sucked into the seating and block all egress. On many boilers, two water gauges are fitted, since any gauge may work badly at times. The glasses are tested to a pressure of 3,000 pounds or more to the square inch before use. It is of the utmost importance that a person in charge of a boiler should know what pressure the steam has reached. Every boiler is therefore fitted with one steam gauge, many with two, lest one might be unreliable. There are two principal types of steam gauge. One, the Borden, and two, the Schaefer-Budenberg. The principle of the Borden is illustrated by Figure 13, in which A is a piece of rubber tubing closed at one end, and at the other drawn over the nozzle of a cycle tire inflator. If bent in a curve as shown, the section of the tube is an oval. When air is pumped in, the rubber walls endeavor to assume a circular section. Because this shape encloses a larger area than an oval of equal circumference, and therefore makes room for a larger volume of air. In doing so, the tube straightens itself and assumes the position indicated by the dotted lines. Hang an empty inner tube of a pneumatic tire over a nail and inflate it, and you'll get a good illustration of the principle. In Figure 14, we have a Borden gauge with part of the dial face broken away to show the internal mechanism. T is a flat metal tube soldered at one end in a hollow casting, into which screws a tap connector with the boiler. The other end, closed, is attached to a link, L, which works as an arm of a quadrant rack, R, engaged with a small pinion, P, actuating the pointer. As the steam pressure rises, the tube T moves its free end outwards toward the position shown by the dotted lines, and traverses the arm of the rack, so shifting the pointer round the scale. As the pressure falls, the tube gradually returns to its zero position. The Schaefer-Budenberg gauge depends for its action on the elasticity of a thin corrugated metal plate, on one side of which steam presses. As the plate bulges upward, it pushes up a small rod resting on it, which operates a quadrant and rack similar to that of the Borden gauge. The principle is employed in another form for the aneroid barometer. The water supply to a boiler. The water inside a boiler is kept at a proper level by 1 pumps or 2 injectors. The former are more commonly used on stationary and marine boilers, as their mechanism is much the same as that of an ordinary force pump, which will be described in a later chapter. We may pass at once to the injector, now almost universally used on locomotive, and sometimes on stationary boilers. At first sight, the injector is a mechanical paradox, since it employs the steam from a boiler to blow water into the boiler. In Figure 15, we have an illustration of the principle in an injector. Steam is led from the boiler through pipe A, which terminates in a nozzle surrounded by a cone, connecting by the pipe B with the water tank. When steam is turned on, it rushes with immense velocity from the nozzle and creates a partial vacuum in cone E, which soon fills with water. On meeting the water, the steam condenses, but not before it has imparted some of its velocity to the water, which thus gains sufficient momentum to force down the valve and find its way to the boiler. The overflow space, OO, between E and C allows steam and water to escape until the water has gathered the requisite momentum. A form of injector very commonly used is Gifford's. Steam is allowed to enter by screwing up the valve V. As it rushes through the nozzle of the cone A, it takes up water and projects it into the mixing cone B, which can be raised or lowered by the pinion D, worked by this hand wheel shown, so as to regulate the amount of water admitted to B. At the center of it is an aperture, O, communicated with the overflow. The water pressure to the boiler through the valve of the left. It will be noticed that the cone A and the part of B above the orifice O contract downward. This is to convert the pressure of the steam into velocity. Below O is a cone, the diameter of which increases downwards. Here the velocity of the water is converted back into pressure in obedience to a well-known hydromechanic law. An injector does not work well if the feed water be too hot to condense the steam quickly, and it may be taken as a rule that the warmer the water, the smaller is the amount of it injected by a given weight of steam. Some injectors have flat valves covered the overflow orifice to prevent air being sucked in and carried to the boiler. When an injector receives a sudden shock, such as that produced by the passing of a locomotive over points, it is liable to fly off, that is, to stop momentarily, and then send the steam and water through the overflow. If this happens, both steam and water must be turned off, and the injector be restarted, unless it be of the self-starting variety, which automatically controls the admission of water to the mixing cone and allows the injector to pick up of itself. For economy's sake, part of the steam expelled from the cylinders of a locomotive is sometimes used to work an injector, which passes the water on at a pressure of 70 pounds to the square inch to a second injector operated by a high-pressure steam coming direct from the boiler, which increases its velocity sufficiently to overcome the boiler pressure. In this case, only a fraction of the weight of high-pressure steam is required to inject the given weight of water, as compared with that used in a single-stage injector. Chapter 2. The conversion of heat energy into mechanical motion. Having treated at some length the apparatus used for converting water into high-pressure steam, we may pass at once to consider the mechanisms which convert the energy of steam into mechanical motion or work. Steam engines are of two kinds, reciprocating, employing cylinders and cranks, and two, rotary, called turbines. Figure 17 is a skeleton diagram of the simplest form of reciprocating engine. C is a cylinder to which steam is admitted through the steamways, WW, first on one side of the piston, then on the other. The pressure on the piston pushes it along the cylinder, and the force is transmitted through the piston rod, PR, to the connecting rod, CR, which causes the crank, K, to revolve. At the point when the two rods meet, there is a crosshead, H, running to and fro on a guide to prevent the piston rod being broken or bent by the oblique thrusts and pulling, which it imparts through CR to the crank, K. The latter is keyed to a shaft carrying the flywheel, or in the case of a locomotive, the driving wheels. The crankshaft revolves in bearings. The internal diameter of the cylinder is called its bore. The travel of the piston is called its stroke. The distance from the center of the shaft to the edge of the crank pin is called the crank's throw, which is half of the piston's stroke. An engine of this type is called double-acting, as the piston is pushed alternatively backwards and forwards by the steam. When piston rod, connecting rod, and crank lie in a straight line, that is, when the piston is fully out or fully in, the crank is said to be at a dead point. For, were the crank to turn to such a position, the admission of steam would not produce motion, since the thrust or pull would be entirely absorbed by the bearings. Locomotive, marine, and all other engines which must be started in any position have at least two cylinders and as many crank sets at an angle to one another. Figure 19 demonstrates that when one crank, C1, of a double-cylinder engine is at a dead point, the other, C2, has reached a position at which the piston exerts the maximum of turning power. In Figure 20, each crank is at a 45 degrees, with the horizontal, and both pistons are able to do work. The power of one piston is constantly increasing while that of the other is decreasing. If single-action cylinders are used, at least 3 of these are needed to produce a perpetual turning movement independent of a flywheel. The function of the flywheel. A flywheel acts as a reservoir of energy to carry the crank of a single-cylinder engine past the dead points. It is useful in all reciprocating engines to produce steady running, as a heavy wheel acts as a drag on the effects of a sudden increase or decrease of steam pressure. In a pump, mangold slicer, cake crusher, or chaff cutter, the flywheel helps the operator to pass his dead points, that is, those parts of the circle described by the handle in which he can do little work. The cylinder of an engine takes the place of the muscular system of the human body. In Figure 21, we have a cylinder and its slide valve shown in the section. First of all, look at P, the piston. Round it are white grooves, RR, in which rings are fitted to prevent the passage of steam past the piston. The rings are cut through at one point in their circumference and slightly opened, so that when in the position they press all around against the walls of the cylinder. After a little use, they settle down to their work, that is, where to a true fit in the cylinder. Each end of the cylinder is closed by a cover, one of which has a bossed cast on it, pierced by a hole for the piston rod to work through. It prevents the escape of steam. The boss is hollowed out to truly accommodate a gland, G1, which is threaded on the rod and screwed up against the boss. The internal space between them is filled with packing. Steam from the boiler enters the steam chest and would have access to both sides of the piston simultaneously through the steamways, WW, were it not for the slide valve, a hollow box open at the bottom, and long enough for its edges to cover both the steamway at once. Between WW is E, the passage for the exhaust steam to escape. The edges of the slide valve are perfectly flat, as it is the face over which the valve moves, so that no steam may pass under the edges. In our illustration, the piston has jumped between to move towards the right. Steam enters by the left steamway, which the valve is just commencing to uncover. As the piston moves, the valve moves in the same direction until the port is fully uncovered. When it begins to move back again, and just before the piston has finished its stroke, the steamway on the right becomes to open. The steamway on the left is now in communication with the exhaust port E, so that the steam has done its duty and is released and pressed from the cylinder by the piston. Reciprocation is the backward and forward motion of the piston, hence the term reciprocating engines. The linear motion of the piston rod is converted into rotary motion by the connecting rod and crank. The use of a crank appears to be so obvious a method of producing the conversion that it is interesting to learn that when James Watt produced his rotating engine in 1780, he was unable to use the crank because it had already been patented by one Matthew Wasborough. Watt was not easily daunted, however, and within a 12-month had himself patented 5 other devices for obtaining rotary motion from a piston rod. Before passing on, it may be mentioned that Watt was the father of the modern, that is, high-pressure steam engine, and that owing to the imperfection of the existing machinery, the difficulties he had to overcome were enormous. On one occasion, he congratulated himself because one of his steam cylinders was only 3/8 of an inch out of truth in the bore. Nowadays, a good firm will reject a cylinder 1/500th of an inch out of truth, and in small petrol engines, 1/5000th of an inch is sometimes the greatest limit of error allowed. Locomotive, marine, and all other engines which must start in any position have at least 2 cylinders and as many cranks set at an angle to one another. And that concludes this installment. Thanks for tuning in.